John Redhead tells of a little boy who wrote an essay on the anatomy of the human body. This is the way a part of the essay read. Your head is kind of round and hard, and your brains are in it, and your hair is on it. Your neck is what keeps your head out of your collar. It's hard to keep clean. Your stomach is something that if you don't eat often enough, it hurts, and spinach don't help none. Your spine is a long bone in your back that is always behind you, no matter how quick you turn around. Your arms you have to pitch with, and so you can reach the butter. Your legs is what you run on, and your toes is what you always got stubbed. And that's all there is of you except what's inside, and I never saw that. End of quote. I don't know what grade the boy got, but I hope it was a good one. I hope someone also told him before he got very much older that the part which is inside is by far the most important. The major battleground of every life is the mind, it is the heart, it's what takes place within. The work of the doctor and the work of the counselor would be so much more simple if this were not true. You recall when Joshua assembled the tribes in Shechem, he reminded them what great things God had done for them. And in the 15th verse of the 24th chapter, he said, "Choose you this day whom ye will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the flood, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land ye dwell." He was saying to the people of Israel that within yourself this whole matter has to be resolved ultimately. He was saying what happens inside a person is ultimately where the great decision is made. Someone has commented that God's victories are won only on the battlefields of the human heart. Yes, I hope someone told that little boy just how important is what is inside of one. For such a war is constantly going on there, and I imagine a sacrament of Holy Communion service is one where people come thinking more deeply about those problems and about those conflicts than any other service in the Christian church. For it's coming to the table of him who did have conflict. It's coming to the table of him who knew the meaning of the eternal battleground. It's coming to the table of one who shared. There are so many passions that are seeking to take over, so many drives that are urging us on in one direction or the other. There are so many desires that are seeking fulfillment. There is so much that is evil seeking to overcome all that is good. And the choice is not always easy, even as it was not an easy choice for the people of Shechem. After all, they were living in a land where the gods had been fairly good to the people. And they were fearful that if they turned against the gods of the Amorites, probably the God of Israel would not be sufficient to take up the slack. Sometimes you see these things that seem to be so important at the moment make it impossible for us to find the vista that comes from the more eternal view. So the poet said, "Within my earthly temple there's a crowd." There's one of us that's humble, one that's proud. There's one that's broken-hearted for his sins, and one that unrepentant sits and grins. There's one that loves his neighbor as himself, and one who cares for naught but fame and pelf. From such corroding cares I would be free if I could just determine which is me. Problem isn't it? Which is me? We're not in a world where the choices are always between the black and white. Sometimes the choices have to come in from the gray area. Sometimes it's not just easy to know which is the way that God would have us to go. But of this we may be sure, the real me is going to be determined by what one desires. The thing that he is seeking for most within his heart. For it's those desires, they are the things that cut a channel into one's soul. Jesus saw it so clearly. Remember, he said, "Ye have heard that it has been said by them of old time, Thou shalt not kill, and whosoever shall kill shall be in the danger of the judgment. But I say unto you that whosoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment." So far as Christ was concerned, it was the real man was the one who was inside. It was the person who was cultivating certain desires, who was tolerating certain thoughts. This was the real man. I imagine if one had gone to the people of Israel of the time of Ezekiel and had asked them what they wanted most, they probably would have talked in terms of doing justly and loving mercy, of even walking humbly with God. But the prophet knew that this was not true. And so in the book of Ezekiel, you find the words, "As the ancients of the house of Israel do in the dark, every man in the chamber of his imagery." It was what was happening down inside that couldn't be seen. This was the real character of the people of Israel. For the ancients of the house of Israel used to go about in caves that were so lovely from the outside, but inside they were filled with all kinds of sins and abominations. The prophet said, "This is what you are." And as the ancients of the house of Israel did these things in the dark, so every man in the chamber of his imagery, that's the thing that he does by himself, the things that he does unseen by man, this is the real person. So it was. The battle had been fought between the evil and the good, so far as he was concerned. The evil had won, and the victims had become the servants of the victory. Donald MacLeod tells of a young South African who was in an automobile accident. He was only in his teens, but he lost both of his legs. He tried so hard to be courageous, and before he left the hospital, he was an inspiration to the medical staff and every person who went to see him. And one night, a nurse heard him pray to God, "Oh God, please don't let this destroy me inside." Now, there are some people listening who know very well what he was going through. So many things that can destroy us inside if we just give them their road: bitterness, remorse, self-pity, despair, impatience. They can destroy one. And it's what we have allowed those things to do to us inside that becomes the real me. They can destroy one inside if he doesn't throw himself and all of his spiritual power onto the other side. That's not an easy thing to do. It's not an easy thing to do at all unless one recognizes with that young South African that day after day, you and I are in a fight for our very lives. Every time that one of these temptations comes to us, that threatens to take possession of our souls, we are in a fight for our spiritual lives. For we're going to become what that decision says. And that's a rather frightening thought. We've got to call together all the forces we can muster to stand up against it. I'm sure many of you read Lloyd Douglas's old novel called White Banner. One of his earlier works. And there was one section that was touching on this matter. One character said, "Sally, the greatest thing anybody can do is to build himself up strongly within. The trouble with most people is that they don't think enough of the value of their own inner self. It means a great deal," she said, "to have a lot of strength under lock and key." Well, it does. Strength that comes from making a habit of doing business in deep waters. That when we see a challenge, when we see an opportunity for the cultivation of the deep things of the soul, we don't draw back from it. But we recognize there's something to be gained here in Christ's name. Strength that comes from knowing that there is something within life that is so sacred that it has to be lived up to. It's bigger than the law, and it's richer than any external force. Think of it. 30 years of our Lord's life was really tied up within the words, "He was subject unto them." There were principles of life to which he must be obedient. Principles of life to which he made the confession, "You are my master." There were inner controls that kept him subject unto the high things of life. He too was given his opportunity to choose. He went through the battle. "Command these stones to be made bread. Cast thyself down from the temple. Bow down and worship the devil and the kingdom of the world." But Jesus said, "Get thee behind me, Satan." Through the years, he had built himself up strongly within. That's the deciding factor where the final choice has to be made. That's where the great battle is joined. And it doesn't matter how much advice or counsel we seek from any person. Eventually, the real decision that has to do with our moral and spiritual life is something that takes place within us. And we win it for God and against the devil, or we don't. Life at its deepest is a lonely struggle. Don't you think that Jesus was touching on this when he said, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God"? Hearts that are freed from all trappings that would stand between themselves and what God would have them to be. There's strength for living in that, and how it came out with Milton when in his moments of despair, you recall he started to write that great sonnet on his blindness, and in the early part of it, it looked as though Satan were getting the better of him. When I consider how my light is spent ere half my days in this dark world and wide, and that one talent, which is death to hide, lodged with me useless. Those are the words of a defeated man. But Milton had done some work on his soul. Milton had done some inner strengthening. And in that same sonnet came the counterattack. God, he saith, doth not need either man's work or his own gifts, who best bears his mild yoke. They serve him best. He won the battle of the soul because he always kept room there for God. That was the plea of a greater than Milton. That we get to know the Father better. That we get to know the power that comes from God. He fought the battle of the soul. He made the choice as to whom he was going to serve. And we partake of this sacrament in remembrance of him. May we be given the faith that whatever our struggle is day, in him is the victory. Amen.